On May 1st, 2018, a B-1B Lancer flying 20,000 feet over Texas suffered a sudden and severe engine fire. Inside, its 4 crew members ran through the emergency checklist, shutting down systems and deploying fire suppression, but nothing worked. The fire kept burning. As the flames crept dangerously close to the fuel lines, there was only one thing left to do: eject. But as one crewman pulled the handle, though the hatch exploded free and a wall of night air tore through the cockpit, the seat stayed locked in place. Ejection seats in the B-1B are timed to fire in sequence, one after another, just milliseconds apart, to prevent collisions mid-air. If one seat malfunctions, it throws off the entire chain. Another might fire too early. 2 could launch at once. One crew member could be ejected directly into another. The system built to save them had just turned against them. Further investigations into other Air Force ejection seat systems would uncover a dark and disturbing secret. The beginning. From the earliest days of flight, engineers sought ways to improve chances of survival if the crews were put in the dangerous position of abandoning their aircraft. Early solutions were crude, to say the least. Bungee cords, compressed air, and spring-loaded catapults designed to propel the pilot off the area before the deployment of a parachute. By World War II, the golden age of fighters, the need for a fully realized mechanical escape system was now undeniable. G-forces, high speeds, violent chases, and powerful airflow pinned pilots inside their cockpits, leaving many with no way out. Though the first practical ejection seats were developed by Henkel in Germany and Saab in Sweden, the first real test came for the Germans. On January 13, 1942, test pilot Helmut Schenk, while flying a Henkel HE-280 experimental jet prototype over Rostock, the aircraft iced over and became uncontrollable. At just over 7,800 feet, with his jet gliding powerless and outright refusing to respond, Schenk became the first man in history to reach for the handle beneath his seat and be expelled by an explosive charge so powerful it sent him hurtling clear of the fuselage. A moment later, his parachute deployed, leading him to drift to the ground, shocked but alive, while the HE-280 spiraled away, lost forever. Following this proof of concept, and with jet aircraft capable of more than 500 mile-per-hour speeds on the horizon, bailing out the old-fashioned way was no longer an option. High-tech ejection seats were now essential. Over the following decades, this technology advanced dramatically all over the world, including the introduction of zero-zero seats, giving pilots the option to eject even from a stationary aircraft on the ground, with no altitude and no speed required. Yet the margin for error, even for the most advanced ejection seats, is razor-thin, and when something goes wrong, it does so fast. Complex machines. Modern ejection seats operate through a minutely choreographed sequence of mechanical and explosive steps. From the moment a pilot pulls the handle, small charges known as cartridge-actuated devices, or CADs, detonate, launching the seat out of the cockpit using either rockets or a gas-powered catapult at very high speeds. Almost immediately, tiny parachutes deploy behind the seat to keep it stable and prevent it from tumbling through the air. Finally, once the seat reaches the right speed and altitude, the main parachute kicks in and slows the descent, giving the crew members a chance to make it back to the ground alive and well. But that precision comes at a cost. Every ejection seat relies on a tightly timed chain of events, all triggered by components built to survive extreme stress: heat, vibration, moisture, and age. However, many of those components are years, some even decades old, and if even one link in the system fails, the results can be fatal. A worn ignition part could delay the launch by just a fraction of a second, or a mechanical fault might knock the seat way off course. If the sensors misread the aircraft's position, the parachute could open too late, or not at all. With critical parts often sourced from subcontractors or aging supply chains, quality control isn't always guaranteed. The United States Air Force knows this all too well. Between 1981 and 1995, the service recorded hundreds of ejections across its fleet, with overall fatality rates ranging from 0 up to 11%, all depending on aircraft type, altitude, and timing. Under ideal conditions, survivability could reach as high as 95%, but those numbers only tell part of the story. If a pilot ejects too low, too fast, or at the wrong angle, What the Air Force calls outside the envelope, the survival rates can plummet to less than 25%. For those who do survive, the trauma doesn't always end in the air. According to one study, nearly 60% of ejection survivors experience some form of spine trauma, ranging from minor compression fractures to long-term disability, often caused by the extreme acceleration forces at launch. Other injuries range from head trauma, broken limbs, or violent whiplash as their heads snap forward. A lot even sustain flail injuries, the result of arms or legs whipping uncontrollably in the wind blast. But no statistics report prepares a crew for what it feels like when the system actually begins to break down around them. A routine flight gone wrong. On May 1st, 2018, a B-1B Lancer from Dyess Air Force Base thundered through the Texas sky as it returned from a routine training mission. Inside the cockpit was a young crew of 4, consisting of instructor pilot Major Christopher Dewan, weapons systems officer and instructor Captain Matthew Leroy Sutton, student pilot First Lieutenant Joseph Welch, and student weapons officer First Lieutenant Thomas Ahern. As the foursome settled in for the return leg home, suddenly and without warning, a firelight blazed across the instrument panel. Engine 3 was on fire. If the flames reached the fuel lines, the entire aircraft could blow up. The 4 men began running the emergency checklist. First, they shut down the affected engine, cutting fuel flow to starve the flames. Then, they deployed the onboard fire suppression system, flooding the engine bay with extinguishing agents designed to suffocate combustion. The team then checked for secondary warnings, temperature spikes, hydraulic failures, and signs of structural damage. But the fire kept burning. As the heat rose, there was only one final step left in the checklist: eject the crew immediately. Cease ejection. The original B-1A model was designed with a crew escape capsule, but when the Air Force revived the program in the 1980s as the B-1B, these were replaced with 4 individual ACES-2 ejection seats to reduce weight and complexity. The ACES-2, widely used in American fighter jets and bombers, features automatic sequencing to prevent mid-air collisions and zero-zero capability. With over 600 recorded ejections at the time, the model had proven quite effective. Now ready, the 4-person crew high above Texas braced for an ejection sequence they had drilled countless times. The hatch above the Offensive Systems Operator, or OSO, blasted free, spinning into the night. A heartbeat later, the seat should have fired, launching him clear of the aircraft. After a few seconds that felt like hours for the 4-person crew, there was no roar of rockets and no violent burst into the sky. Instead, though the hatch was gone and the night wind was howling around them, the OSO still sat motionless, strapped into a seat that had armed itself but refused to fire. With the fire still burning, what began as a controlled escape was now spiraling into disaster. If they continued, the seats could miss fire, colliding mid-air or worse. Now, all their lives were in jeopardy. Aircraft Commander Major Dewan had mere seconds to decide. He could follow procedure and eject, knowing one crew member was already trapped, or attempt the impossible: bring a burning bomber home. According to a later report, the aircraft commander assessed the situation for 2 seconds and said, quote, "Cease ejection. We'll try to land." Team effort. With no other option, the Lancer turned toward Midland International Air and Spaceport, more than 150 miles away, to make an emergency landing on an aircraft that was already on fire, with a blown-out hatch and without cockpit pressurization. On board, everyone knew that this was a nightmare scenario. One jolt of turbulence, one wrong move, and all would be lost. For 25 minutes, the OSO was trapped in the live seat, gripping the armrests and barely breathing. Nonetheless, through fire, uncertainty, and the looming threat of detonation, the 4 crew members managed to touch down at Midland International, the trapped airman still locked in his seat. As the aircraft finally rolled to a stop, for the first time since the emergency began, silence filled the cockpit. The incident became the first ever successful landing of a B-1B experiencing an ejection failure, saving not just a $400 million aircraft, but also 4 men who had refused to abandon one of their own. Following the May 1st, 2018 incident, top brass at the Air Force were quick to notice that suspect this very close call could be traced back to the ACES-2 ejection system, which failed when it was needed most. Not willing to take any chances, on June 7th, the branch ordered a fleet-wide grounding of all B-1B bombers, halting operations until every aircraft could be inspected. For nearly 2 weeks, maintenance crews tore through the entire fleet, linking the issue to a defective rig pin, a small yet critical part that disrupted the ejection sequence, whose error occurred after the escape hatch had already blown off. According to investigators, had the aircraft commander not made the call to land instead of ejecting, the outcome could have been catastrophic. On July 13, 2018, the Air Force awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest awards for heroism in aerial flight, to Major Christopher Dewan, Captain Matthew Leroy Sutton, First Lieutenant Joseph Welch, and First Lieutenant Thomas Ahern for their bravery during the May 1st emergency, honoring their extraordinary decision-making, composure, and most of all, teamwork. In a public statement, Secretary of the Air Force Dr. Heather Wilson was proud to say that, quote, "The courage it took and the valor represented by that aircraft commander who decided, we're going to try for all of us to make it, rather than sacrifice the one guy who can't get out. Those are the men and women who choose to wear the uniform of the United States Air Force." What to do? The crew of the B-1B had a story of teamwork, leadership, and trust in each other when everything was on the line. But not every pilot is given that choice. On June 20th, 2020, as the entire world wrestled with the effects of a sudden pandemic, in the skies above Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, First Lieutenant David Schmitz, aboard an F-16CM Fighting Falcon, steadied his grip on the controls, ready to perform a procedure he'd never done before. As the cockpit glowed with the dull green of instruments, the 32-year-old pilot of the 77th Fighter Squadron was deep into a nighttime qualification flight, pushing himself through one of the most demanding skill sets in a fighter pilot's arsenal, air-to-air refueling. As all fighter pilots and instructors headed southwest into the darkness toward the KC-135 Stratotanker waiting ahead, one by one, the trainees connected, battling the rowdy air but managing to take on fuel. However, when it was his turn, despite multiple tries, brutal weather and turbulent conditions complicated each and every attempt. According to his instructor, frustration was evident in Schmitz's voice. Even when his superior tried to ease the tension with a joke, the trainee simply exhaled, quote, "no excuse." With fuel reserves dropping rapidly and unable to establish a connection, both Schmitz and his instructor, each in separate aircraft, decided to abort the mission and turn back toward base. The return flight was routine, until at 10:26 p.m., just as pilot Schmitz aligned his F-16CM for landing, the runway lights stretching ahead, something felt off. His descent carried him too low. Without warning, a sudden jolt made the aircraft's belly slam into the localizer antenna array, just a short distance shy of the runway threshold. The impact sent a violent shudder through the jet, twisting the left main landing gear and leaving part of the brace hanging uselessly. Although the nose dipped, Schmitz fought for control, pulling the jet back into the air and leaving debris scattered behind. But the damage was done, and now, with a standard landing out of the question, directional control was now also compromised. As the fuel reserves dwindled with every passing minute, inside the cockpit, the nervous Schmitz listened carefully as voices of his superiors on the radio debated the final course of action, the options narrowing more than ever. In the end, the final consensus from the ground crew settled on a risky maneuver to catch the arresting cable positioned at the end of the runway and use the jet's tailhook to bring the damaged aircraft to a halt. As preparations began, Schmitz, methodical as ever, knew that something felt wrong, and for good reason. Unknown to him, the checklist he was relying on was written for a jet with minor issues in mind, not one that had just slammed into the ground and was barely holding together. Nonetheless, when no more apparent alternative was presented, at 10:50 p.m., pilot Schmitz began his final approach, aiming for the arresting cable. But as the runway drew closer and closer, the hook missed, making the F-16 instantly lurch to the left and causing the damaged wing to collide with the pavement, scattering sparks in the night. Realizing the aircraft was beyond recovery, like many men and women before him had done for nearly 8 decades, Schmitz reached for the last resort handle that was supposed to save him. But as the canopy flew clear and the seat launched, the critical parachute never deployed. In mere seconds, a training flight became an irreversible tragedy. buried truths. The immediate aftermath incident report found that a cascading series of pilot errors occurred when Schmitz became frustrated after being unable to carry the refueling and having to cut his nighttime training flight short. It also cited Schmitz's misinterpretation of the approach lighting system, lack of prior daytime refueling training, and lack of leadership. Although it acknowledged an ejection seat malfunction, its findings focused on procedural failures. But sometime later, new evidence would suggest a far more unsettling truth. Schmitz's widow, Valerie Rudolph, was consumed by grief and dozens of unanswered questions, starting with why such a high-risk training event was conducted at night. According to Rudolph, quote, "You've got this new pilot in the squadron. He's fresh out of F-16B course. He hasn't done aerial refueling yet. Hasn't been doing a whole lot of flying lately due to COVID. Don't skip steps. I don't think it's fair to the pilots. I know I only have Dave's case as an example to really go off of, but it does make me wonder." On June 28, 2022, Rudolph filed a lawsuit against the Air Force's contractors, alleging that components of her husband's ejection seat may have been counterfeit. At the center of her fight stood the giants of defense contracting: Lockheed Martin, who built Schmitz's F-16, Collins Aerospace, responsible for the ACES-2 ejection seat, and Teledyne Technologies, maker of the critical digital recovery sequencer, the very device that had failed Schmitz in his final moments. On a successful ejection, the digital recovery sequencer, or DRS, deploys the parachute within seconds. But in Schmitz's case, 6 of these critical pyrotechnics never fired. Investigators concluded that Schmitz had just 3.4 seconds to manually activate the emergency parachute handle, an extremely narrow window, especially given the chaotic conditions of that night's events. According to Rudolph, supported by former maintainers and field experts, the failure of Schmitz's ejection seat was a known issue the Air Force had overlooked for years. In 2014, a similar malfunction exposed flaws in the DRS, prompting the service to issue a time-compliance technical order to address the defect. But fixing the problem across the fleet was slow. Supply chain delays and a lack of urgency meant that by 2020, many aircraft, including Schmitz's F-16, never received the upgrade. Thanks to a Freedom of Information Act request filed by Rudolph's team, previously unknown details from the Accident Investigation Board revealed an unsettling and bone-chilling revelation. The U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory found suspected counterfeit components inside Schmitz's digital recovery sequencer. 6 MOSFET transistors, 3 serial flash memory chips, and 1 parallel flash memory chip, all critical to the ejection sequence, were identified as potentially unauthorized parts. The ACES-2 ejection seat from the F-16 is also found in the F-15 Eagle, F-22 Raptor, A-10 Thunderbolt II, B-1 Lancer, and B-2 Spirit, totaling more than 2,500 seats across multiple Air Force fleets. With counterfeit components hidden among them, it's anyone's guess how many more sit silently defective, waiting to fail when they're needed the most. The latest failure. The unsettling questions raised by Schmitz's loss echoed even louder 4 years later. Another pilot, Captain John Robertson, became the latest victim of an ejection seat malfunction, this time on the ground. On May 13, 2024, at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, Captain Robertson, an instructor pilot with the 80th Operations Support Squadron, was in the midst of conducting ground operations in a T-6A Texan II when his ejection seat unexpectedly activated. Despite immediate medical attention, Captain Robertson succumbed to his injuries the following day. Robertson's untimely passing has only intensified scrutiny over the reliability of ejection seats. In 2022, the U.S. Air Force temporarily grounded hundreds of T-38 and T-6 trainers over concerns that defective cartridge-actuated devices could prevent seats from firing when needed. Although Martin Baker, the manufacturer of the T-6's ejection seat, has repeatedly emphasized that it produces its own CADs in-house, whether the 2024 accident was caused by a CAD failure, mechanical defect, or another issue remains unknown, but it has reignited concerns over who should be trusted to build the next generation of escape systems. Just days before the accident, a House Armed Services Committee report questioned Collins Aerospace's exclusive contract to supply ACES-5 ejection seats for the next generation escape system. Awarded in 2020, this massive deal covers T-7A trainers, F-15s, F-16s, F-22s, and B-2 bombers. With doubts growing, lawmakers now debate reopening competition, potentially allowing Martin Baker, supplier of Mark 18 seats for the F-16 Block 70, to challenge Collins Aerospace directly. But for pilots strapping into those seats every day, the debate over contracts means little. For those few men and women who fly, the question remains: when the moment comes, will their ejection seat take them safely to the ground?